The Ransom of Red Chief by O. Henry. It looked like a good thing, but wait till I tell you. We were down south, in Alabama. Bill Driscoll and myself, when this kidnapping idea struck us. It was, as Bill afterward expressed it, during a moment of temporary mental apparition. But we didn't find that out till later. There was a town down there, as flat as a flannel cake, and called Summit, of course. It contained inhabitants of as undeleterious and self-satisfied a class of peasantry as ever clustered around a maypole. Bill and me had a joint capital of about $600, and we needed just $2,000 more to pull off a fraudulent town lot scheme in western Illinois with. We talked it over on the front steps of the hotel. Philoprogenitiveness, says we, is strong in semi-rural communities. Therefore, and for other reasons, a kidnapping project ought to do better there than in the radius of newspapers that send reporters out in plain clothes to stir up talk about such things. We knew that Summit couldn't get after us with anything stronger than constables and, maybe, some lackadaisical bloodhounds and a diatribe or two in the weekly farmer's budget. So, it looked good. We selected for our victim the only child of a prominent citizen named Ebenezer Dorset. The father was respectable and tight, a mortgage fancier and a stern, upright collection plate passer and forecloser. The kid was a boy of 10, with bas-relief freckles, and hair the color of the cover of the magazine you buy at the newsstand when you want to catch a train. Bill and me figured that Ebenezer would melt down for a ransom of $2,000 to a cent. But wait till I tell you. About 2 miles from Summit was a little mountain, covered with a dense cedar brake. On the rear elevation of this mountain was a cave. There we stored provisions. One evening after sundown, we drove in a buggy past old Dorset's house. The kid was in the street, throwing rocks at a kitten on the opposite fence. "Hey, little boy," says Bill, "would you like to have a bag of candy and a nice ride?" The boy catches Bill neatly in the eye with a piece of brick. "That will cost the old man an extra $500, says Bill, climbing over the wheel. That boy put up a fight like a welterweight cinnamon bear. But, at last, we got him down in the bottom of the buggy and drove away. We took him up to the cave, and I hitched the horse in the cedar brake. After dark I drove the buggy to the little village, 3 miles away, where we had hired it, and walked back to the mountain. Bill was pasting court plaster over the scratches and bruises on his features. There was a fire burning behind the big rock at the entrance of the cave, and the boy was watching a pot of boiling coffee, with 2 buzzard tail feathers stuck in his red hair. He points a stick at me when I come up, and says, "Ah, cursed paleface, do you dare to enter the camp of Red Chief, the terror of the plains?" "He's all right now," says Bill, rolling up his trousers and examining some bruises on his shins. "We're playing Indian. We're making Buffalo Bill's show look like magic lantern views of Palestine in the town hall. I'm old Hank, the trapper, Red Chief's captive, and I'm to be scalped at daybreak. By Geronimo, that kid can kick hard." Yes, sir, that boy seemed to be having the time of his life. The fun of camping out in a cave had made him forget that he was a captive himself. He immediately christened me Snake Eye, the spy, and announced that, when his braves returned from the warpath, I was to be broiled at the stake at the rising of the sun. Then we had supper, and he filled his mouth full of bacon and bread and gravy and began to talk. He made a during dinner speech something like this: "I like this fine. I never camped out before, but I had a pet possum once, and I was 9 last birthday. I hate to go to school. Rats ate up 16 of Jimmy Talbot's aunt's speckled hen's eggs. Are there any real Indians in these woods? I want some more gravy. Does the trees moving make the wind blow? We had 5 puppies. What makes your nose so red, Hank? My father has lots of money. Are the stars hot? I whipped Ed Walker twice, Saturday. I don't like girls. You doesn't catch toads unless with a string. Do oxen make any noise? Why are oranges round? Have you got beds to sleep on in this cave? Amos Murray has got 6 toes. A parrot can talk, but a monkey or a fish can't. How many does it take to make 12? Every few minutes he would remember that he was a pesky redskin, and pick up his stick rifle and tiptoe to the mouth of the cave to rubber for the scouts of the hated paleface. Now and then he would let out a war whoop that made old Hank the trapper shiver. That boy had Bill terrorized from the start. "Red Chief," says I to the kid, "would you like to go home?" "Ah, what for?" says he. I don't have any fun at home. I hate to go to school. I like to camp out. You won't take me back home again, Snake Eye, will you? Not right away, says I. We'll stay here in the cave a while. All right, says he. That'll be fine. I never had such fun in all my life. We went to bed about 11 o'clock. We spread down some wide blankets and quilts and put Red Chief between us. We weren't afraid he'd run away. He kept us awake for 3 hours, jumping up and reaching for his rifle and screeching, hissed, hard, in mine and Bill's ears, as the fancied crackle of a twig or the rustle of a leaf revealed to his young imagination the stealthy approach of the outlaw band. At last, I fell into a troubled sleep and dreamed that I had been kidnapped and chained to a tree by a ferocious pirate with red hair. Just at daybreak, I was awakened by a series of awful screams from Bill. They weren't yells or howls or shouts or whoops or yops, such as you'd expect from a manly set of vocal organs. They were simply indecent, terrifying, humiliating screams, such as women emit when they see ghosts or caterpillars. It's an awful thing to hear a strong, desperate, fat man scream incontinently in a cave at daybreak. I jumped up to see what the matter was. Red Chief was sitting on Bill's chest, with one hand twined in Bill's hair. In the other, he had the sharp case knife we used for slicing bacon, and he was industriously and realistically trying to take Bill's scalp, according to the sentence that had been pronounced upon him the evening before. I got the knife away from the kid and made him lie down again. But, from that moment, Bill's spirit was broken. He laid down on his side of the bed, but he never closed an eye again in sleep as long as that boy was with us. I dozed off for a while, but along towards sunup, I remembered that Red Chief had said I was to be burned at the stake at the rising of the sun. I wasn't nervous or afraid, but I sat up and lit my pipe and leaned against a rock. "What you getting up so soon for, Sam?" asked Bill. "Me?" says I. "Oh, I got a kind of a pain in my shoulder. I thought sitting up would rest it." "You're a liar," says Bill. "You're afraid. You was to be burned at sunrise, and you was afraid he'd do it. And he would too, if he could find a match. Ain't it awful, Sam? Do you think anybody will pay out money to get a little imp like that back home?" "Sure," said I. "A rowdy kid like that is just the kind that parents dote on. Now, you and the chief get up and cook breakfast, while I go up on the top of this mountain and reconnoiter." I went up on the peak of the little mountain and ran my eye over the contiguous vicinity. Over towards summit, I expected to see the sturdy yeomanry of the village, armed with scythes and pitchforks, beating the countryside for the dastardly kidnappers. But what I saw was a peaceful landscape dotted with one man plowing with a dun mule. Nobody was dragging the creek. No couriers dashed hither and yon, bringing tidings of no news to the distracted parents. There was a sylvan attitude of somnolent sleepiness pervading that section of the external outward surface of Alabama that lay exposed to my view. "Perhaps," says I to myself, "it has not yet been discovered that the wolves have borne away the tender lambkin from the fold. Heaven help the wolves," says I, and I went down the mountain to breakfast. When I got to the cave, I found Bill backed up against the side of it, breathing hard, and the boy threatening to smash him with a rock half as big as a coconut. "He put a red-hot boiled potato down my back," explained Bill, "and then mashed it with his foot, and I boxed his ears. Have you got a gun about you, Sam?" I took the rock away from the boy and kind of patched up the argument. "I'll fix you," says the kid to Bill. "No man ever yet struck the Red Chief, but what he got paid for it. You better beware." After breakfast, the kid takes a piece of leather with strings wrapped around it out of his pocket and goes outside the cave unwinding it. "What's he up to now?" says Bill, anxiously. "You don't think he'll run away, do you, Sam?" "No fear of it," says I. "He don't seem to be much of a homebody, but we've got to fix up some plan about the ransom. There don't seem to be much excitement around Summit on account of his disappearance, but maybe they haven't realized yet that he's gone. His folks may think he's spending the night with Aunt Jane or one of the neighbors. Anyhow, he'll be missed today. Tonight, we must get a message to his father demanding the $2,000 for his return." Just then we heard a kind of war whoop, such as David might have emitted when he knocked out the champion Goliath. It was a sling that Red Chief had pulled out of his pocket, and he was whirling it around his head. I dodged, and heard a heavy thud and a kind of a sigh from Bill, like a horse gives out when you take his saddle off. A niggerhead rock the size of an egg had caught Bill just behind his left ear. He loosened himself all over and fell in the fire across the frying pan of hot water for washing the dishes. I dragged him out and poured cold water on his head for half an hour. By and by, Bill sits up and feels behind his ear and says, "Sam, do you know who my favorite biblical character is?" "Take it easy," says I. "You'll come to your senses presently." "King Herod," says he. "You won't go away and leave me here alone, will you, Sam?" I went out and caught that boy and shook him until his freckles rattled. "If you don't behave," says I, "I'll take you straight home. Now, are you going to be good, or not?" "I was only funning," says he sullenly. "I didn't mean to hurt old Hank, but what did he hit me for? I'll behave, Snake Eye, if you won't send me home, and if you'll let me play the Black Scout today." "I don't know the game," says I. "That's for you and Mr. Bill to decide. He's your playmate for the day. I'm going away for a while on business. Now, you come in and make friends with him and say you are sorry for hurting him, or home you go at once." I made him and Bill shake hands, and then I took Bill aside and told him I was going to Poplar Cove, a little village 3 miles from the cave, and find out what I could about how the kidnapping had been regarded in Summit. Also, I thought it best to send a peremptory letter to Old Man Dorset that day, demanding the ransom and dictating how it should be paid. "You know, Sam," says Bill, "I've stood by you without batting an eye in earthquakes, fire and flood in poker games, dynamite outrages, police raids, train robberies and cyclones. I never lost my nerve yet till we kidnapped that 2-legged skyrocket of a kid. He's got me going. You won't leave me long with him, will you, Sam?" "I'll be back sometime this afternoon," says I. "You must keep the boy amused and quiet till I return, and now we'll write the letter to old Dorset." Bill and I got paper and pencil and worked on the letter while Red Chief, with a blanket wrapped around him, strutted up and down, guarding the mouth of the cave. Bill begged me tearfully to make the ransom $1,500 instead of $2,000. "I ain't attempting," says he, "to decry the celebrated moral aspect of parental affection, but we're dealing with humans, and it ain't human for anybody to give up $2,000 for that 40-pound chunk of freckled wildcat. I'm willing to take a chance at $1,500. You can charge the difference up to me." So, to relieve Bill, I acceded, and we collaborated a letter that ran this way. "Ebenezer Dorset, ESQ. We have your boy concealed in a place far from Summit. It is useless for you, or the most skillful detectives to attempt to find him. Absolutely, the only terms on which you can have him restored to you are these. We demand $1,500 in large bills for his return. The money to be left at midnight tonight at the same spot and in the same box as your reply as hereinafter described. If you agree to these terms, send your answer in writing by a solitary messenger tonight at 8:30. After crossing Owl Creek, on the road to Poplar Cove, there are 3 large trees about 100 yards apart, close to the fence of the wheat field on the right-hand side. At the bottom of the fence post, opposite the 3rd tree, will be found a small pasteboard box. The messenger will place the answer in this box and return immediately to Summit. If you attempt any treachery or fail to comply with our demand as stated, you will never see your boy again. If you pay the money as demanded, he will be returned to you safe and well within 3 hours. These terms are final, and if you do not accede to them, no further communication will be attempted. 2 desperate men. I addressed this letter to Dorset and put it in my pocket. As I was about to start, the kid comes up to me and says, "Ah, Snake Eye, you said I could play the Black Scout while you was gone." "Play it, of course," says I. "Mr. Bill will play with you. What kind of a game is it?" "I'm the Black Scout," says Red Chief, "and I have to ride to the stockade to warn the settlers that the Indians are coming. I'm tired of playing Indian myself. I want to be the Black Scout." "All right," says I. "It sounds harmless to me. I guess Mr. Bill will help you foil the pesky savages." "What am I to do?" asks Bill, looking at the kid suspiciously. "You are the hoss," says Black Scout. "Get down on your hands and knees. How can I ride to the stockade without a hoss?" "You'd better keep him interested," said I, "till we get the scheme going. Loosen up." Bill gets down on his all fours, and a look comes in his eye like a rabbit's when you catch it in a trap. "How far is it to the stockade, kid?" he asks, in a husky manner of voice. 90 miles, says the Black Scout, and you have to hump yourself to get there on time. Whoa now. The Black Scout jumps on Bill's back and digs his heels in his side. "For heaven's sake," says Bill, "hurry back, Sam, as soon as you can. I wish we hadn't made the ransom more than 1,000. Say, you quit kicking me or I 11 get up and warm you good." I walked over to Poplar Cove and sat around the post office and store, talking with the chawbacons that came in to trade. One whiskeran says that he hears Summit is all upset on account of elder Ebenezer Dorset's boy having been lost or stolen. That was all I wanted to know. I bought some smoking tobacco, referred casually to the price of black-eyed peas, posted my letter surreptitiously, and came away. The postmaster said the mail carrier would come by in an hour to take the mail on to Summit. When I got back to the cave, Bill and the boy were not to be found. I explored the vicinity of the cave and risked a yodel or two, but there was no response. So I lighted my pipe and sat down on a mossy bank to await developments. In about half an hour I heard the bushes rustle, and Bill wobbled out into the little glade in front of the cave. Behind him was the kid, stepping softly like a scout, with a broad grin on his face. Bill stopped, took off his hat, and wiped his face with a red handkerchief. The kid stopped about 8 feet behind him. "Sam," says Bill, "I suppose you'll think I'm a renegade, but I couldn't help it. I'm a grown person with masculine proclivities and habits of self-defense, but there is a time when all systems of egotism and predominance fail. The boy is gone. I have sent him home. All is off. There was martyrs in old times, goes on Bill, that suffered death rather than give up the particular graft they enjoyed. None of them ever was subjugated to such supernatural tortures as I have been. I tried to be faithful to our articles of depredation, but there came a limit." "What's the trouble, Bill?" I asks him. "I was rode," says Bill, "the 90 miles to the stockade, not barring an inch. Then, when the settlers was rescued, I was given oats. Sand ain't a palatable substitute. And then, for an hour I had to try to explain to him why there was nothing in holes, how a road can run both ways and what makes the grass green. I tell you, Sam, a human can only stand so much. I takes him by the neck of his clothes and drags him down the mountain. On the way he kicks my legs black and blue from the knees down, and I've got 2 or 3 bites on my thumb and hand cauterized. But he's gone," continues Bill, "gone home. I showed him the road to Summit and kicked him about 8 feet nearer there at one kick. I'm sorry we lose the ransom, but it was either that or Bill Driscoll to the madhouse." Bill is puffing and blowing, but there is a look of ineffable peace and growing content on his rose-pink features. "Bill," says I, "there isn't any heart disease in your family, is there?" "No," says Bill, "nothing chronic except malaria and accidents." "Why?" "Then you might turn around," says I, "and have a look behind you." Bill turns and sees the boy, and loses his complexion and sits down plump on the ground and begins to pluck aimlessly at grass and little sticks. For an hour I was afraid for his mind, and then I told him that my scheme was to put the whole job through immediately and that we would get the ransom and be off with it by midnight if old Dorset fell in with our proposition. So Bill braced up enough to give the kid a weak, sort of a smile, and a promise to play the Russian in a Japanese war with him as soon as he felt a little better. I had a scheme for collecting that ransom without danger of being caught by counterplots that ought to commend itself to professional kidnappers. The tree under which the answer was to be left and the money later on was close to the road fence with big, bare fields on all sides. If a gang of constables should be watching for anyone to come for the note, they could see him a long way off crossing the fields or in the road. But no, siree. At 8:30 I was up in that tree, as well hidden as a tree toad, waiting for the messenger to arrive. Exactly on time, a half-grown boy rides up the road on a bicycle, locates the pasteboard box at the foot of the fence post, slips a folded piece of paper into it and pedals away again back towards Summit. I waited an hour and then concluded the thing was square. I slid down the tree, got the note, slipped along the fence till I struck the woods, and was back at the cave in another half an hour. I opened the note, got near the lantern, and read it to Bill. It was written with a pen in a crabbed hand, and the sum and substance of it was this: Two desperate men. Gentlemen, I received your letter today by post. In regard to the ransom you ask for the return of my son, I think you are a little high in your demands, and I hereby make you a counter proposition, which I am inclined to believe you will accept. You bring Johnny home and pay me $250 in cash, and I agree to take him off your hands. You had better come at night, for the neighbors believe he is lost, and I couldn't be responsible for what they would do to anybody they saw bringing him back. Very respectfully, Ebenezer Dorset. Great pirates of Penzance, says I, of all the impudent. But I glanced at Bill and hesitated. He had the most appealing look in his eyes I ever saw on the face of a dumb or a talking brute. Sam, says he, what's $250 after all? We've got the money. One more night of this kid will send me to a bed in Bedlam. Besides being a thorough gentleman, I think Mr. Dorset is a spendthrift for making us such a liberal offer. You ain't going to let the chance go, are you? Tell you the truth, Bill, says I, this little he-ewe lamb has somewhat got on my nerves too. We'll take him home, pay the ransom, and make our getaway. We took him home that night. We got him to go by telling him that his father had bought a silver-mounted rifle and a pair of moccasins for him, and we were going to hunt bears the next day. It was just 12 o'clock when we knocked at Ebenezer's front door. Just at the moment when I should have been abstracting the $1,500 from the box under the tree, according to the original proposition, Bill was counting out $250 into Dorset's hand. When the kid found out we were going to leave him at home, he started up a howl like a calliope and fastened himself as tight as a leech to Bill's leg. His father peeled him away gradually, like a porous plaster. How long can you hold him? Asks Bill. I'm not as strong as I used to be, says old Dorset, but I think I can promise you 10 minutes. Enough, says Bill. In 10 minutes I shall cross the central, southern, and middle western states and be legging it trippingly for the Canadian border. And, as dark as it was, and as fat as Bill was, and as good a runner as I am, he was a good mile and a half out of Summit before I could catch up with him. The Ransom of Mac. By O. Henry. Me and old Mac Lonsbury, we got out of that little hide-and-seek gold mine affair with about $40,000 apiece. I say old Mac, but he wasn't old. 41, I should say, but he always seemed old. Andy, he says to me, I'm tired of hustling. You and me have been working hard together for 3 years. Say we knock off for a while and spend some of this idle money we've coaxed our way. The proposition hits me just right, says I. Let's be nabobs for a while and see how it feels. What'll we do take in the Niagara Falls or Bucket Faro? For a good many years, says Mac, I've thought that if I ever had extravagant money I'd rent a 2-room cabin somewhere, hire a Chinaman to cook, and sit in my stocking feet and read Buckle's History of Civilization. That sounds self-indulgent and gratifying without vulgar ostentation, says I, and I don't see how money could be better invested. Give me a cuckoo clock and a Sepp Winter's self-instructor for the banjo, and I'll join you. A week afterwards me and Mac hits this small town of Pena, about 30 miles out from Denver, and finds an elegant 2-room house that just suits us. We deposited half a peck of money in the Pena Bank and shook hands with every one of the 340 citizens in the town. We brought along the Chinaman and the cuckoo clock and Buckle and the instructor with us from Denver, and they made the cabin seem like home at once. Never believe it when they tell you riches don't bring happiness. If you could have seen old Mac sitting in his rocking chair with his blue yarn sock, feet up in the window, and absorbing in that Buckle stuff through his specs, you'd have seen a picture of content that would have made Rockefeller jealous. And I was learning to pick out old Zip Coon on the banjo, and the cuckoo was on time with his remarks, and Ah Sing was messing up the atmosphere with the handsomest smell of ham and eggs that ever laid the honeysuckle in the shade. When it got too dark to make out Buckle's nonsense and the notes in the instructor, me and Mac would light our pipes and talk about science and pearl diving and sciatica and Egypt and spelling and fish and trade winds and leather and gratitude and eagles, and a lot of subjects that we'd never had time to explain our sentiments about before. One evening Mac spoke up and asked me if I was much apprised in the habits and policies of women folks. Why, yes, says I, in a tone of voice. I know him from Alfred to Omaha. The feminine nature and similitude, says I, is as plain to my sight as the Rocky Mountains is to a blue-eyed burro. I'm onto all their little sidesteps and punctual discrepancies. I tell you, Andy, says Mac with a kind of sigh, I never had the least amount of intersection with their predispositions. Maybe I might have had a proneness in respect to their vicinity, but I never took the time. I made my own living since I was 14, and I never seemed to get my ratiocinations equipped with the sentiments usually depicted toward the sect. I sometimes wish I had, says old Mac. They're an adverse study, says I, and adapted to points of view. Although they vary in rationale, I have found them quite often obviously differing from each other in divergences of contrast. It seems to me, goes on Mac, that a man had better take him in and secure his inspirations of the sect when he's young and so preordained. I let my chance go by, and I guess I'm too old now to go hopping into the curriculum. Oh, I don't know, I tells him. Maybe you better credit yourself with a barrel of money and a lot of emancipation from a quantity of uncontent. Still, I don't regret my knowledge of him, I says. It takes a man who understands the symptoms and byplays of women folks to take care of himself in this world. We stayed on in Pena because we liked the place. Some folks might enjoy their money with noise and rapture and locomotion, but me and Mac, we had had plenty of turmoils and hotel towels. The people were friendly. Ah Sing got the swing of the grub we liked. Mac and Buckle were as thick as two body snatchers, and I was hitting out a cordial resemblance to Buffalo Gals, Can't You Come Out Tonight, on the banjo. One day, I got a telegram from Spate, the man that was working on a mine I had an interest in out in New Mexico. I had to go out there, and I was gone 2 months. I was anxious to get back to Pena and enjoy life once more. When I struck the cabin, I nearly fainted. Mac was standing in the door, and if angels ever wept, I saw no reason why they should be smiling then. That man was a spectacle. Yes, he was worse. He was a spyglass. He was the great telescope in the Lick Observatory. He had on a coat and shiny shoes and a white vest and a high silk hat, and a geranium as big as an order of spinach was spiked onto his front. And he was smirking and warping his face like an infernal storekeeper or a kid with colic. Hello, Andy, says Mac, out of his face. Glad to see you back. Things have happened since you went away. I know it, says I, and a sacrilegious sight it is. God never made you that way, Mac Lonsbury. Why do you scarify his works with this presumptuous kind of ribaldry? Why, Andy, says he, they've elected me justice of the peace since you left. I looked at Mac close. He was restless and inspired. A justice of the peace ought to be disconsolate and assuaged. Just then a young woman passed on the sidewalk, and I saw Mac kind of half snicker and blush, and then he raised up his hat and smiled and bowed, and she smiled and bowed and went on by. No hope for you, says I, if you've got the Mary Jane infirmity at your age. I thought it wasn't going to take on you. And patent leather shoes. All this in 2 little short months. I'm going to marry the young lady who just passed tonight, says Mac, in a kind of flutter. I forgot something at the post office, says I, and walked away quick. I overtook that young woman 100 yards away. I raised my hat and told her my name. She was about 19, and young for her age. She blushed, and then looked at me cool, like I was the snow scene from the 2 orphans. I understand you are to be married tonight, I said. Correct, says she. You got any objections? Listen, sissy, I begins. My name is Miss Rebosa Red, says she in a pained way. I know it, says I. Now, Rebosa, I'm old enough to have owed money to your father, and that old, specious, dressed up, garbled, seasick Tomaine prancing about avidiously like an irremediable turkey gobbler with patent leather shoes on is my best friend. Why did you go and get him invested in this marriage business? Why, he was the only chance there was, answers Miss Rebosa. Nay, says I, giving a sickening look of admiration at her complexion and style of features. With your beauty you might pick any kind of a man. Listen, Rebosa, old Mac ain't the man you want. He was 22 when you was nae read, as the papers say. This bursting into bloom won't last with him. He's all ventilated with oldness and rectitude and decay. Old Mac's down with a case of Indian summer. He overlooked his bet when he was young. And now he's suing nature for the interest on the promissory note he took from Cupid instead of the cash. Rebosa, are you bent on having this marriage occur? Why, sure I am, says she, oscillating the pansies on her hat. And so is somebody else, I reckon. What time is it to take place? I asks. At 6 o'clock, says she. I made up my mind right away what to do. I'd save old Mac if I could. To have a good, seasoned, ineligible man like that turn chicken for a girl that hadn't quit eating slate pencils and buttoning in the back was more than I could look on with easiness. Rebosa, says I, earnest, drawing upon my display of knowledge concerning the feminine intuitions of reason. Ain't there a young man in Pina, nice young man that you think a heap of? Yep, says Rebosa, nodding her pansies. Sure there is. What do you think? Gracious. Does he like you? I asks. How does he stand in the matter? Crazy, says Rebosa. Ma has to wet down the front steps to keep him from sitting there all the time. But I guess that'll be all over after tonight, she winds up with a sigh. Rebosa, says I, you don't really experience any of this adoration called love for old Mac, do you? Lord, no, says the girl, shaking her head. I think he's as dry as a lava bed. The idea. Who is this young man that you like, Rebosa? I inquires. It's Eddie Bales, says she. He clerks in Crosby's grocery, but he don't make but $35 a month. Ella Noakes was wild about him once. Old Mac tells me, I says, that he's going to marry you at 6 o'clock this evening. That's the time, says she. It's to be at our house. Rebosa, says I, listen to me. If Eddie Bales had $1,000 cash, $1,000, mind you, would buy him a store of his own. If you and Eddie had that much to excuse matrimony on, would you consent to marry him this evening at 5 o'clock? The girl looks at me a minute, and I can see these inaudible cogitations going on inside of her, as women will. $1,000, says she. Of course I would. Come on, says I. We'll go and see Eddie. We went up to Crosby's store and called Eddie outside. He looked to be estimable and freckled, and he had chills and fever when I made my proposition. At 5 o'clock, says he, for $1,000? Please don't wake me up. Well, you are the rich uncle retired from the spice business in India. I'll buy out old Crosby and run the store myself. We went inside and got old man Crosby apart and explained it. I wrote my check for $1,000 and handed it to him. If Eddie and Rebosa married each other at 5, he was to turn the money over to them. And then I gave him my blessing and went to wander in the wildwood for a season. I sat on a log and made cogitations on life and old age and the zodiac and the ways of women and all the disorder that goes with a lifetime. I passed myself congratulations that I had probably saved my old friend Mac from his attack of Indian summer. I knew when he got well of it and shed his infatuation and his patent leather shoes, he would feel grateful. To keep old Mac disinvolved, thinks I, from relapses like this, is worth more than $1,000. And most of all, I was glad that I'd made a study of women and wasn't to be deceived any by their means of conceit and evolution. It must have been 5:30 when I got back home. I stepped in, and there sat old Mac on the back of his neck in his old clothes with his blue socks on the window and the history of civilization propped up on his knees. This don't look like getting ready for a wedding at 6, I says, to seem innocent. Oh, says Mac, reaching for his tobacco, that was postponed back to 5 o'clock. They sent me over a note saying the hour had been changed. It's all over now. What made you stay away so long, Andy? You heard about the wedding? I asks. I operated it, says he. I told you I was justice of the peace. The preacher is off east to visit his folks, and I'm the only one in town that can perform the dispensations of marriage. I promised Eddie and Rebosa a month ago I'd marry him. He's a busy lad, and he'll have a grocery of his own someday. He will, says I. There was lots of women at the wedding, says Mac, smoking up, but I didn't seem to get any ideas from him. I wish I was informed in the structure of their attainments like you said you was. That was 2 months ago, says I, reaching up for the banjo. The Purple Dress. By O. Henry. We are to consider the shade known as purple. It is a color justly in repute among the sons and daughters of man. Emperors claim it for their especial dye. Good fellows everywhere seek to bring their noses to the genial hue that follows the commingling of the red and blue. We say of princes that they are born to the purple, and no doubt they are, for the colic tinges their faces with the royal tint equally with the snub-nosed countenance of a woodchopper's brat. All women love it when it is the fashion. And now purple is being worn. You notice it on the streets. Of course other colors are quite stylish as well. In fact, I saw a lovely thing the other day in olive green albatross, with a triple-lapped flounce skirt trimmed with insert squares of silk, and a draped fichu of lace opening over a shirred vest and double puff sleeves with a lace band holding two gathered frills. You see lots of purple too. Oh yes, you do. Just take a walk down 23rd Street any afternoon. Therefore Maida, the girl with the big brown eyes and cinnamon-colored hair in the Beehive store, said to grace the girl with the rhinestone brooch and peppermint pepsin flavor to her speech, "I'm going to have a purple dress, a tailor-made purple dress for Thanksgiving." "Oh, are you?" said Grace, putting away some 71/2 gloves into the 63-4 box. "Well, it's me for red. You see more red on Fifth Avenue, and the men all seem to like it." "I like purple best," said Maida. "And old Schlegel has promised to make it for $8. It's going to be lovely. I'm going to have a plaited skirt and a blouse coat trimmed with a band of galloon under a white cloth collar with 2 rows of sly boots," said Grace with an educated wink. "Soutache braid over a surpliced white vest, and a plaited basque and—" sly boots," repeated Grace. "Plaited jigget sleeves with a drawn velvet ribbon over an inside cuff." "What do you mean by saying that?" "You think Mr. Ramsay likes purple. I heard him say yesterday he thought some of the dark shades of red were stunning." "I don't care," said Maida. "I prefer purple, and them that don't like it can just take the other side of the street." Which suggests the thought that after all, the followers of purple may be subject to slight delusions. Danger is near when a maiden thinks she can wear purple regardless of complexions and opinions, and when emperors think their purple robes will wear forever. Maida had saved $18 after 8 months of economy, and this had bought the goods for the purple dress and paid Schlegel $4 on the making of it. On the day before Thanksgiving, she would have just enough to pay the remaining $4. And then for a holiday in a new dress, can earth offer anything more enchanting? Old Bachman, the proprietor of the Beehive store, always gave a Thanksgiving dinner to his employees. On every one of the subsequent 364 days, excusing Sundays, he would remind them of the joys of the past banquet and the hopes of the coming ones, thus inciting them to increased enthusiasm in work. The dinner was given in the store on one of the long tables in the middle of the room. They tacked wrapping paper over the front windows, and the turkeys and other good things were brought in the back way from the restaurant on the corner. You will perceive that the Beehive was not a fashionable department store with escalators and pompadours. It was almost small enough to be called an emporium, and you could actually go in there and get waited on and walk out again. And always at the Thanksgiving dinners, Mr. Ramsay. Oh bother. I should have mentioned Mr. Ramsay first of all. He is more important than purple or green, or even the red cranberry sauce. Mr. Ramsay was the head clerk, and as far as I am concerned, I am for him. He never pinched the girls' arms when he passed them in dark corners of the store, and when he told them stories when business was dull and the girls giggled and said, "Oh, Shaw." It wasn't G. Bernard, they meant it all. Besides being a gentleman, Mr. Ramsay was queer and original in other ways. He was a health crank, and believed that people should never eat anything that was good for them. He was violently opposed to anybody being comfortable and coming in out of snowstorms, or wearing overshoes, or taking medicine, or coddling themselves in any way. Every one of the 10 girls in the store had little pork chop and fried onion dreams every night of becoming Mrs. Ramsay. For next year old Bachman was going to take him in for a partner, and each one of them knew that if she should catch him, she would knock those cranky health notions of his sky high before the wedding cake indigestion was over. Mr. Ramsay was master of ceremonies at the dinners. Always they had 2 Italians in to play a violin and harp and had a little dance in the store. And here were 2 dresses being conceived to charm Ramsay, one purple and the other red. Of course, the other 8 girls were going to have dresses too, but they didn't count. Very likely they'd wear some shirtwaist and black skirt affairs, nothing as resplendent as purple or red. Grace had saved her money too. She was going to buy her dress ready-made. Oh, what's the use of bothering with a tailor when you've got a figure? It's easy to get a fit. The ready-made are intended for a perfect figure, except I have to have 'em all taken in at the waist. Average figure is so large-waisted. The night before Thanksgiving came. Maida hurried home, keen and bright with the thoughts of the blessed morrow. Her thoughts were of purple, but they were white themselves, the joyous enthusiasm of the young for the pleasures that youth must have or wither. She knew purple would become her, and for the 1000th time, she tried to assure herself that it was purple Mr. Ramsay said he liked and not red. She was going home first to get the $4 wrapped in a piece of tissue paper in the bottom drawer of her dresser, and then she was going to pay Schlegel and take the dress home herself. Grace lived in the same house. She occupied the hall room above Maida's. At home, Maida found clamor and confusion. The landlady's tongue clattering sourly in the halls like a churned dasher dabbing in buttermilk. And then Grace come down to her room crying with eyes as red as any dress. "She says I've got to get out," said Grace. "The old beast. Because I owe her $4. She's put my trunk in the hall and locked the door. I can't go anywhere else. I haven't got a cent of money." "You had some yesterday," said Maida. "I paid it on my dress," said Grace. "I thought she'd wait till next week for the rent." Sniffle, sniffle, sob, sniffle. Out came out it had to come Maida's $4. "You blessed darling," cried Grace, now a rainbow instead of sunset. "I'll pay the mean old thing, and then I'm going to try on my dress. I think it's heavenly. Come up and look at it. I'll pay the money back, $1 a week, honest I will." Thanksgiving. The dinner was to be at noon. At 11:45 Grace switched into Maida's room. Yes, she looked charming. Red was her color. Maida sat by the window in her old Cheviot skirt and blue waist darning a St. "Oh, doing fancy work. Why, goodness me. Ain't you dressed yet?" shrilled the red one. "How does it fit in the back? Don't you think these velvet tabs look awful swell? Why ain't you dressed, Maida?" "My dress didn't get finished in time," said Maida. "I'm not going to the dinner." "That's too bad." "Why, I'm awfully sorry, Maida. Why don't you put on anything and come along? It's just the store folks, you know, and they won't mind." "I was set on my purple," said Maida. "If I can't have it, I won't go at all. Don't bother about me. Run along, or you'll be late. You look awful nice in red." At her window, Maida sat through the long morning and passed the time of the dinner at the store. In her mind, she could hear the girls shrieking over a pole bone, could hear old Batchman's roar over his own deeply concealed jokes, could see the diamonds of fat Mrs. Bachman, who came to the store only on Thanksgiving days, could see Mr. Ramsay moving about, alert, kindly, looking to the comfort of all. At 4 in the afternoon, with an expressionless face and a lifeless air, she slowly made her way to Schlegel's shop and told him she could not pay the $4 due on the dress. "God!" cried Schlegel, angrily. "For what do you look so glum? Take him away. He is ready. Pay me some time. Have I not seen you pass mine shop every day in 2 years? If I make clothes, is it that I do not know how to read Beeples? Because you will pay me some time when you can. Take him away. He is made good. And if you look bready in him, all right. So, pay me when you can." Maida breathed a millionth part of the thanks in her heart and hurried away with her dress. As she left the shop, a smart dash of rain struck upon her face. She smiled and did not feel it. Ladies who shop in carriages, you do not understand. Girls whose wardrobes are charged to the old man's account, you cannot begin to comprehend. You could not understand why Maida did not feel the cold dash of the Thanksgiving rain. At 5 o'clock, she went out upon the street wearing her purple dress. The rain had increased, and it beat down upon her in a steady, wind-blown pour. People were scurrying home and to cars with close-held umbrellas and tight, buttoned raincoats. Many of them turned their heads to marvel at this beautiful, serene, happy-eyed girl in the purple dress walking through the storm as though she were strolling in a garden under summer skies. I say you do not understand it, ladies of the full purse and varied wardrobe. You do not know what it is to live with a perpetual longing for pretty things, to starve 8 months in order to bring a purple dress and a holiday together. What difference if it rained, hailed, blew, snowed, cycloned? Maida had no umbrella nor overshoes. She had her purple dress, and she walked abroad. Let the elements do their worst. A starved heart must have one crumb during a year. The rain ran down and dripped from her fingers. Someone turned a corner and blocked her way. She looked up into Mr. Ramsay's eyes, sparkling with admiration and interest. "Why, Miss Maida," said he, "you look simply magnificent in your new dress. I was greatly disappointed not to see you at our dinner. And of all the girls I ever knew, you show the greatest sense and intelligence. There is nothing more healthful and invigorating than braving the weather as you are doing. May I walk with you?" And Maida blushed and sneezed. The Proem, by O. Henry, by the Carpenter. They will tell you in Anchuria that President Miraflores, of that volatile republic, died by his own hand in the coast town of Coralio, that he had reached thus far in flight from the inconveniences of an imminent revolution, and that $100,000 government funds, which he carried with him in an American leather valise as a souvenir of his tempestuous administration, was never afterward recovered. For a real, a boy will show you his grave. It is back of the town near a little bridge that spans a mangrove swamp. A plain slab of wood stands at its head. Someone has burned upon the headstone with a hot iron this inscription:
Ramón Ángel de las Cruces y Miraflores, presidente de la República de Anchuria, que sea su juez Dios.
It is characteristic of this buoyant people that they pursue no man beyond the grave. Let God be his judge. Even with the 100,000 unfound, though they greatly coveted, the hue and cry went no further than that. To the stranger or the guest, the people of Coralio will relate the story of the tragic end of their former president. How he strove to escape from the country with the Publice funds and also with Dona Isabel Gilbert, the young American opera singer. And how, being apprehended by members of the opposing political party in Coralio, he shot himself through the head rather than give up the funds, and in consequence, the Senorita Gilbert. They will relate further that Dona Isabel, her adventurous bark of fortune, shoaled by the simultaneous loss of her distinguished admirer and the souvenir 100,000, dropped anchor on this stagnant coast, awaiting a rising tide. They say, in Coralio, that she found a prompt and prosperous tide in the form of Frank Goodwin, an American resident of the town, an investor who had grown wealthy by dealing in the products of the country, a banana king, rubber prints, a sarsaparilla, indigo, and mahogany baron. The Senorita Gilbert, you will be told, married Senor Goodwin 1 month after the president's death. Thus, in the very moment when fortune had ceased to smile, wresting from her a gift greater than the prize withdrawn. Of the American, Don Frank Goodwin, and of his wife, the natives have nothing but good to say. Don Frank has lived among them for years, and has compelled their respect. His lady is easily queen of what social life the sober coast affords. The wife of the governor of the district, herself, who was of the proud Castilian family of Montelian y Dolorosa de los Santos y Mendez, feels honored to unfold her napkin with olive-hued, ringed hands at the table of Sonora Goodwin. Were you to refer, with your northern prejudices, to the vivacious past of Mrs. Goodwin when her audacious and gleeful abandon in light opera captured the mature president's fancy, or to her share in that statesman's downfall and malfeasance, the Latin shrug of the shoulder would be your only answer and rebuttal. What prejudices there were in Coralio concerning Sonora Goodwin seemed now to be in her favor, whatever they had been in the past. It would seem that the story is ended instead of begun, that the close of tragedy and the climax of a romance have covered the ground of interest. But, to the more curious reader, it shall be some slight instruction to trace the close threads that underlie the ingenious web of circumstances. The headpiece bearing the name of President Miraflores is daily scrubbed with soap bark and sand. An old half-breed Indian tends the grave with fidelity and the dawdling minuteness of inherited sloth. He chops down the weeds and ever-springing grass with his machete. He plucks ants and scorpions and beetles from it with his horny fingers, and sprinkles its turf with water from the plaza fountain. There is no grave anywhere so well kept and ordered. Only by following out the underlying threads will it be made clear why the old Indian Galves is secretly paid to keep green the grave of President Miraflores by one who never saw that unfortunate statesman in life or in death, and why that one was wont to walk in the twilight, casting from a distance looks of gentle sadness upon that unhonored mound. Elsewhere than at Coralio, one learns of the impetuous career of Isabel Gilbert. New Orleans gave her birth, and the mingled French and Spanish Creole nature that tinctured her life with such turbulence and warmth. She had little education, but a knowledge of men and motives that seemed to have come by instinct. Far beyond the common woman was she endowed with intrepid rashness, with a love for the pursuit of adventure to the brink of danger, and with desire for the pleasures of life. Her spirit was one to chafe under any curb. She was Eve after the fall, but before the bitterness of it was felt. She wore life as a rose in her bosom. Of the legion of men who had been at her feet, it was said that but one was so fortunate as to engage her fancy. To President Miraflores, the brilliant but unstable ruler of Anchuria, she yielded the key to her resolute heart. How, then, do we find her, as the Coralians would have told you, the wife of Frank Goodwin, and happily living a life of dull and dreamy inaction? The underlying threads reach far, stretching across the sea. Following them out, it will be made plain why Shorty O'Day, of the Columbia Detective Agency, resigned his position, and, for a lighter pastime, it shall be a duty and a pleasing sport to wander with Momus beneath the tropic stars where Melpomene once stalked austere. Now to cause laughter to echo from those lavish jungles and frowing crags where formerly rang the cries of pirates' victims. To lay aside pike and cutlass and attack with quip and jollity. To draw one saving titter of mirth from the rusty cask of romance, this were pleasant to do in the shade of the lemon trees on that coast that is curved like lips set for smiling. For there are yet tales of the Spanish Main, that segment of continent washed by the tempestuous Caribbean, and presenting to the sea a formidable border of tropical jungle topped by the overweening Cordilleras, is still begirt by mystery and romance. In past times, buccaneers and revolutionists roused the echoes of its cliffs, and the condor wheeled perpetually above where, in the green groves, they made food for him with their matchlocks and Toledos. Taken and retaken by sea rovers, by adverse powers, and by sudden uprising of rebellious factions, the historic 300 miles of adventurous coast has scarcely known for hundreds of years whom rightly to call its master. Pizarro, Balboa, Sir Francis Drake, and Bolivar did what they could to make it a part of Christendom. Sir John Morgan, Lafitte, and other eminent swashbucklers bombarded and pounded it in the name of Abaddon. The game still goes on. The guns of the rovers are silenced. But the tintype man, the enlarged photograph brigand, the Kodaking tourist, and the scouts of the gentle brigade of fakirs have found it out and carry on the work. The hucksters of Germany, France, and Sicily now bag in small change across their counters. Gentlemen adventurers throng the waiting rooms of its rulers with proposals for railways and concessions. The little opera bouffe nations play at government and intrigue until some day a big, silent gunboat glides into the offing and warns them not to break their toys. And with these changes comes also the small adventurer, with empty pockets to fill, light of heart, busy-brained, the modern fairy prince, bearing an alarm clock with which, more surely than by the sentimental kiss, to awaken the beautiful tropics from their centuries' sleep. Generally, he wears a shamrock, which he matches pridefully against the extravagant palms, and it is he who had driven Melpomene to the wings and set comedy to dancing before the footlights of the Southern Cross. So, there is a little tale to tell of many things. Perhaps to the promiscuous ear of the walrus it shall come with most avail, for in it there are indeed shoes and ships and sealing wax and cabbage palms and presidents instead of kings. Add to these a little love and counterplotting, and scatter everywhere throughout the maze a trail of tropical dollars warmed no more by the torrid sun than by the hot palms of the scouts of fortune. After all, here seems to be life itself, with talk enough to weary the most garrulous of walruses. The Prisoner of Zembla, by O. Henry. So the king fell into a furious rage, so that none durst go near him for fear, and he gave out that since the Princess Osla had disobeyed him there would be a great tourney, and to the knight who should prove himself of the greatest valor he would give the hand of the princess. And he sent forth a herald to proclaim that he would do this. And the herald went about the country making his desire known, blowing a great tin horn and riding a noble steed that pranced and gambled. And the villagers gazed upon him and said, "Lo, That is one of them tin-horn gamblers concerning which the chroniclers have told us. And when the day came, the king sat in the grandstand, holding the gauge of battle in his band, and by his side sat the Princess Asla, looking very pale and beautiful, but with mournful eyes from which she scarce could keep the tears. And the knights which came to the tourney gazed upon the princess in wonder at her beauty, and each swore to win so that he could marry her and board with the king. Suddenly the heart of the princess gave a great bound, for she saw among the knights one of the poor students with whom she had been in love. The knights mounted and rode in a line past the grandstand, and the king stopped the poor student, who had the worst horse and the poorest caparisons of any of the knights, and said, "Sir knight, prithee tell me of what that marvelous shaky and rusty-looking armor of thine is made?" "Oh, king," said the young knight, "seeing that we are about to engage in a big fight, I would call it scrap iron, wouldn't you?" "Ods bodkins," said the king, "the youth hath a pretty wit." About this time the Princess Asla, who began to feel better at the sight of her lover, slipped a piece of gum into her mouth and closed her teeth upon it, and even smiled a little and showed the beautiful pearls with which her mouth was set. Whereupon, as soon as the knights perceived this, 217 of them went over to the king's treasurer and settled for their horse feed and went home. "It seems very hard," said the princess, "that I cannot marry when I choose." But 2 of the knights were left, one of them being the princess lover. "Here's enough for a fight anyhow," said the king. "Come hither, O knights, will ye joust for the hand of this fair lady?" "We joust will," said the knights. The 2 knights fought for 2 hours, and at length the princess lover prevailed and stretched the other upon the ground. The victorious knight made his horse caracal before the king and bowed low in his saddle. On the Princess Asla's cheeks was a rosy flush. In her eyes the light of excitement vied with the soft glow of love. Her lips were parted, her lovely hair unbound, and she grasped the arms of her chair and leaned forward with heaving bosom and happy smile to hear the words of her lover. "You have foughten well, Sir Knight," said the king, "and if there is any boon you crave you have but to name it." "Then," said the knight, "I will ask you this. I have bought the patent rights in your kingdom for Schneider's celebrated monkey wrench, and I want a letter from you endorsing it." "You shall have it," said the king, "but I must tell you that there is not a monkey in my kingdom." With a yell of rage, the victorious knight threw himself on his horse and rode away at a furious gallop. The king was about to speak, when a horrible suspicion flashed upon him, and he fell dead upon the grandstand. "My God," he cried, "he has forgotten to take the princess with him." The Princess and the Puma, by O. Henry. There had to be a king and queen, of course. The king was a terrible old man who wore 6 shooters and spurs, and shouted in such a tremendous voice that the rattlers on the prairie would run into their holes under the prickly pear. Before there was a royal family they called the man Whispering Ben. When he came to own 50,000 acres of land and more cattle than he could count, they called him O'Donnell, the cattle king. The queen had been a Mexican girl from Laredo. She made a good, mild, Colorado Claro wife, and even succeeded in teaching Ben to modify his voice sufficiently while in the house to keep the dishes from being broken. When Ben got to be king, she would sit on the gallery of Espinosa Ranch and weave rush mats. When wealth became so irresistible and oppressive that upholstered chairs and a center table were brought down from San Antone in the wagons, she bowed her smooth, dark head and shared the fate of the Danae. To avoid lese majeste, you have been presented first to the king and queen. They do not enter the story, which might be called the Chronicle of the Princess, the Happy Thought, and the Lion that bungled his job. Josepha O'Donnell was the surviving daughter, the princess. From her mother she inherited warmth of nature and a dusky, semi-tropic beauty. From Ben O'Donnell the royal she acquired a store of intrepidity, common sense, and the faculty of ruling. The combination was one worth going miles to see. Josepha, while riding her pony at a gallop, could put 5 out of 6 bullets through a tomato can swinging at the end of a string. She could play for hours with a white kitten she owned, dressing it in all manner of absurd clothes. Scorning a pencil, she could tell you out of her head what 1545 2-year-olds would bring on the hoof at $8.50 per head. Roughly speaking, The Espinosa Ranch is 40 miles long and 30 broad, but mostly leased land. Josefa, on her pony, had prospected over every mile of it. Every cowpuncher on the range knew her by sight and was a loyal vassal. Ripley Givens, foreman of one of the Espinosa outfits, saw her one day and made up his mind to form a royal matrimonial alliance. Presumptuous? No. In those days in the Nueces country, a man was a man. And, after all, the title of cattle king does not presuppose blood royalty. Often it only signifies that its owner wears the crown in token of his magnificent qualities in the art of cattle stealing. One day Ripley Givens rode over to the Double Elm Ranch to inquire about a bunch of strayed yearlings. He was late in setting out on his return trip, and it was sundown when he struck the White Horse crossing of the Nueces. From there to his own camp it was 16 miles. To the Espinosa Ranch it was 12. Givens was tired. He decided to pass the night at the crossing. There was a fine water hole in the riverbed. The banks were thickly covered with great trees, undergrown with brush. Back from the water hole 50 yards was a stretch of curly mesquite grass supper for his horse and bed for himself. Givens staked his horse and spread out his saddle blankets to dry. He sat down with his back against a tree and rolled a cigarette. From somewhere in the dense timber along the river came a sudden, rageful, shivering wail. The pony danced at the end of his rope and blew a whistling snort of comprehending fear. Givens puffed at his cigarette, but he reached leisurely for his pistol belt, which lay on the grass, and twirled the cylinder of his weapon tentatively. A great gar plunged with a loud splash into the water hole. A little brown rabbit skipped around a bunch of catclaw and sat twitching his whiskers and looking humorously at Givens. The pony went on eating grass. It is well to be reasonably watchful when a Mexican lion sings soprano along the arroyos at sundown. The burden of his song may be that young calves and fat lambs are scarce, and that he has a carnivorous desire for your acquaintance. In the grass lay an empty fruit can, cast there by some former sojourner. Givens caught sight of it with a grunt of satisfaction. In his coat pocket tied behind his saddle was a handful or two of ground coffee. Black coffee and cigarettes. What ranchero could desire more? In 2 minutes he had a little fire going clearly. He started, with his can, for the water hole. When within 15 yards of its edge he saw, between the bushes, a side-saddled pony with down-dropped reins cropping grass a little distance to his left. Just rising from her hands and knees on the brink of the water hole was Josefa O'Donnell. She had been drinking water, and she brushed the sand from the palms of her hands. 10 yards away, to her right, half concealed by a clump of sequista, Givens saw the crouching form of the Mexican lion. His amber eyeballs glared hungrily. 6 feet from them was the tip of the tail stretched straight, like a pointer's. His hindquarters rocked with the motion of the cat tribe preliminary to leaping. Givens did what he could. His six-shooter was 35 yards away lying on the grass. He gave a loud yell and dashed between the lion and the princess. The ruckus, as Givens called it afterward, was brief and somewhat confused. When he arrived on the line of attack, he saw a dim streak in the air and heard a couple of faint cracks. Then 100 pounds of Mexican lion plumped down upon his head and flattened him, with a heavy jar, to the ground. He remembered calling out, "Let up, now no fair gouging," and then he crawled from under the lion like a worm, with his mouth full of grass and dirt, and a big lump on the back of his head where it had struck the root of a water elm. The lion lay motionless. Givens, feeling aggrieved and suspicious of fowls, shook his fist at the lion and shouted, "I'll wrestle you again for 20. And then he got back to himself. Josefa was standing in her tracks, quietly reloading her silver, mounted .38. It had not been a difficult shot. The lion's head made an easier mark than a tomato can swinging at the end of a string. There was a provoking, teasing, maddening smile upon her mouth and in her dark eyes. The would-be rescuing knight felt the fire of his fiasco burn down to his soul. Here had been his chance, the chance that he had dreamed of, and Momus, and not Cupid, had presided over it. The satyrs in the wood were, no doubt, holding their sides in hilarious, silent laughter. There had been something like vaudeville say Senior Givens, and his funny knockabout act with the stuffed lion. "Is that you, Mr. Givens?" said Josefa. in her deliberate, saccharine contralto. "You nearly spoilt my shot when you yelled. Did you hurt your head when you fell?" "Oh, no," said Givens quietly. "That didn't hurt." He stooped ignominiously and dragged his best Stetson hat from under the beast. It was crushed and wrinkled to a fine comedy effect. Then he knelt down and softly stroked the fierce, open-jawed head of the dead lion. "Poor old Bill," he exclaimed mournfully. "What's that?" asked Josefa, sharply. "Of course you didn't know, Miss Josefa," said Givens, with an air of one allowing magnanimity to triumph over grief. "Nobody can blame you. I tried to save him, but I couldn't let you know in time." "Save who?" "Why, Bill. I've been looking for him all day. You see, he's been our camp pet for 2 years. Poor old fellow, he wouldn't have hurt a cottontail rabbit. It'll break the boys all up when they hear about it. But you couldn't tell, of course, that Bill was just trying to play with you." Josefa's black eyes burned steadily upon him. Ripley Givens met the test successfully. He stood rumpling the yellow-brown curls on his head pensively. In his eye was regret, not unmingled with a gentle reproach. His smooth features were set to a pattern of indisputable sorrow.
Josefa wavered.
"What was your pet doing here?" she asked, making a last stand. "There's no camp near the White Horse Crossing." "The old rascal ran away from camp yesterday," answered Givens readily. "It's a wonder the coyotes didn't scare him to death. You see, Jim Webster, our horse wrangler, brought a little terrier pup into camp last week. The pup made life miserable for Bill. He used to chase him around and chew his hind legs for hours at a time. Every night when bedtime came, Bill would sneak under one of the boys' blankets and sleep to keep the pup from finding him. I reckon he must have been worried pretty desperate, or he wouldn't have run away. He was always afraid to get out of sight of camp." Josefa looked at the body of the fierce animal. Givens gently patted one of the formidable paws that could have killed a yearling calf with one blow. Slowly a red flush widened upon the dark olive face of the girl. Was it the signal of shame of the true sportsman who has brought down ignoble quarry? Her eyes grew softer, and the lowered lids drove away all their bright mockery. "I'm very sorry," she said humbly, "but he looked so big and jumped so high that—" "Poor old Bill was hungry," interrupted Givens, in quick defense of the deceased. "We always made him jump for his supper in camp. He would lie down and roll over for a piece of meat. When he saw you, he thought he was going to get something to eat from you." Suddenly Josefa's eyes opened wide. "I might have shot you," she exclaimed. "You ran right in between. You risked your life to save your pet. That was fine, Mr. Givens. I like a man who is kind to animals." Yes, there was even admiration in her gaze now. After all, there was a hero rising out of the ruins of the anticlimax. The look on Givens's face would have secured him a high position in the SPCA. "I always loved him," said he. "Horses, dogs, Mexican lions, cows, alligators." "I hate alligators," instantly demurred Josefa. "Crawly, muddy things." "Did I say alligators?" said Givens. "I meant antelopes, of course." Josefa's conscience drove her to make further amends. She held out her hand penitently. There was a bright, unshed drop in each of her eyes. "Please forgive me, Mr. Givens, won't you? I'm only a girl, you know, and I was frightened at first. I'm very, very sorry I shot Bill. You don't know how ashamed I feel. I wouldn't have done it for anything." Givens took the proffered hand. He held it for a time, while he allowed the generosity of his nature to overcome his grief at the loss of Bill. At last it was clear that he had forgiven her. "Please don't speak of it any more, Miss Josefa. 'Twas enough to frighten any young lady the way Bill looked. I'll explain it all right to the boys." "Are you really sure you don't hate me?" Josefa came closer to him impulsively. Her eyes were sweet and pleading with gracious penitence. "I would hate anyone who would kill my kitten. And how daring and kind of you to risk being shot when you tried to save him. How very few men would have done that." Victory wrested from defeat. Vaudeville turned into drama. Bravo, Ripley Givens. It was now twilight. Of course, Miss Josefa could not be allowed to ride on to the ranch house alone. Givens resaddled his pony in spite of that animal's reproachful glances and rode with her. Side by side, they galloped across the smooth grass, the princess and the man who was kind to animals. The prairie odors of fruitful earth and delicate bloom were thick and sweet around them. Coyotes yelping over there on the hill. No fear. And yet, Josefa rode closer. A little hand seemed to grope. Givens found it with his own. The ponies kept an even gait. The hands lingered together, and the owner of one explained, "I never was frightened before, but just think, how terrible it would be to meet a really wild lion. Poor Bill. I'm so glad you came with me." O'Donnell was sitting on the ranch gallery. "Hello, Rip," he shouted. "That you?" "He rode in with me," said Josefa. "I lost my way and was late." "Much obliged," called the cattle king. "Stop over, Rip, and ride to camp in the morning." But Givens would not. He would push on to camp. There was a bunch of steers to start off on the trail at daybreak. He said good night and trotted away. An hour later, when the lights were out, Josefa, in her nightrobe, came to her door and called to the king in his own room across the brick-paved hallway. "Say, Pop, you know that old Mexican lion they call the gotch-eared devil, the one that killed Gonzalez, Mr. Martin's sheep herder, and about 50 calves on the Salado Range? Well, I settled his hash this afternoon over at the White Horse Crossing. Put 2 balls in his head with my .38 while he was on the jump. I knew him by the slice gone from his left ear that old Gonzalez cut off with his machete. You couldn't have made a better shot yourself, Daddy." "Bully for you," thundered Whispering Ben from the darkness of the royal chamber. "The pride of the cities." By O. Henry. Said Mr. Kipling, "The cities are full of pride, challenging each to each." Even so, New York was empty. 200,000 of its people were away for the summer. 3,800,000 remained as caretakers and to pay the bills of the absentees. But the 200,000 are an expensive lot. The New Yorker sat at a roof garden table, ingesting solace through a straw. His Panama lay upon a chair. The July audience was scattered among vacant seats as widely as outfielders when the champion batter steps to the plate. Vaudeville happened at intervals. The breeze was cool from the bay. Around and above, everywhere except on the stage, were stars. Glimpses were to be had of waiters, always disappearing, like startled chamois. Prudent visitors who had ordered refreshments by phone in the morning were now being served. The New Yorker was aware of certain drawbacks to his comfort, but content beamed softly from his rimless eyeglasses. His family was out of town. The drinks were warm. The ballet was suffering from lack of both tune and talcum, but his family would not return until September. Then up into the garden stumbled the man from Topaz City, Nevada. The gloom of the solitary sightseer enwrapped him. Bereft of joy through loneliness, he stalked with a widower's face through the halls of pleasure. Thirst for human companionship possessed him as he panted in the metropolitan draft. Straight to the New Yorker's table he steered. The New Yorker, disarmed and made reckless by the lawless atmosphere of a roof garden, decided upon utter abandonment of his life's traditions. He resolved to shatter with one rash, daredevil, impulsive, hair-brained act the conventions that had hitherto been woven into his existence. Carrying out this radical and precipitous inspiration, he nodded slightly to the stranger as he drew nearer the table. The next moment found the man from Topaz City in the list of the New Yorker's closest friends. He took a chair at the table. He gathered 2 others for his feet. He tossed his broad-brimmed hat upon a fourth and told his life's history to his newfound pard. The New Yorker warmed a little, as an apartment house furnace warms when the strawberry season begins. A waiter who came within hail in an unguarded moment was captured and paroled on an errand to the Dr. Wiley experimental station. The ballet was now in the midst of a musical vagary and danced upon the stage programmed as Bolivian peasants, clothed in some portions of its anatomy as Norwegian fisher maidens, in others as ladies-in-waiting of Marie Antoinette, historically denuded in other portions so as to represent sea nymphs, and presenting the tout ensemble of a social club of Central Park West housemaids at a fish fry. "Been in the city long?" inquired the New Yorker, getting ready the exact tip against the waiters coming with large change from the bill. "Me?" said the man from Topaz City. 4 days. "Never in Topaz City, was you?" "Aye," said the New Yorker. "I was never farther west than 8th Avenue. I had a brother who died on 9th, but I met the cortege at 8th. There was a bunch of violets on the hearse, and the undertaker mentioned the incident to avoid mistake. I cannot say that I am familiar with the West. Topaz City, said the man who occupied 4 chairs, is one of the finest towns in the world. I presume that you have seen the sights of the metropolis, said the New Yorker. 4 days is not a sufficient length of time in which to view even our most salient points of interest, but one can possibly form a general impression. Our architectural supremacy is what generally strikes visitors to our city most forcibly. Of course you have seen our Flatiron building. It is considered. Saw it, said the man from Topaz City. But you ought to come out our way. It's mountainous, you know, and the ladies all wear short skirts for climbing and— Excuse me, said the New Yorker, but that isn't exactly the point. New York must be a wonderful revelation to a visitor from the West. Now, as to our hotels— Say, said the man from Topaz City, that reminds me, there were 16 stage robbers shot last year within 20 miles of— I was speaking of hotels, said the New Yorker. We lead Europe in that respect, and as far as our leisure class is concerned we are far. Oh, I don't know, interrupted the man from Topaz City. There were 12 tramps in our jail when I left home. I guess New York isn't so. Beg pardon, you seem to misapprehend the idea. Of course, you visited the Stock Exchange and Wall Street, where the— Oh, yes, said the man from Topaz City, as he lighted a Pennsylvania stogie. And I want to tell you, chat, we've got the finest town marshal west of the Rockies. Bill Rayner, he took in 5 pickpockets out of the crowd when Red-Nosed Thompson laid the cornerstone of his new saloon. Topaz City don't allow. Have another Rhine wine and seltzer, suggested the New Yorker. I've never been west, as I said, but there can't be any place out there to compare with New York. As to the claims of Chicago, one man, said the Topazite, one man only has been murdered and robbed in Topaz City in the last 3. Oh, I know what Chicago is, interposed the New Yorker. Have you been up 5th Avenue to see the magnificent residences of our mill? Seen him all. You ought to know Reub Stiegel, the assessor of Topaz. When old man Tilbury, that owns the only 2-story house in town, tried to swear his taxes from $6,000 down to $450.75, Reub buckled on his 45 and went down to sea. Yes, but speaking of our great city, one of its greatest features is our superb police department. There is no body of men in the world that can equal it for. That waiter gets around like a Langley flying machine, remarked the man from Topaz City, thirstily. We've got men in our town, too, worth $400,000. There's old Bill Withers and Colonel Metcalf and— Have you seen Broadway at night? Asked the New Yorker, courteously. There are few streets in the world that can compare with it. When the electrics are shining and the pavements are alive with 2 hurrying streams of elegantly clothed men and beautiful women attired in the costliest costumes that wind in and out in a close maze of expensively— Never knew but one case in Topaz City, said the man from the West. Jim Bailey, our mayor, had his watch and chain and $235 in cash taken from his pocket while— That's another matter, said the New Yorker. While you are in our city, you should avail yourself of every opportunity to see its wonders. Our rapid transit system— If you was out in Topaz, broke in the man from there, I could show you a whole cemetery full of people that got killed accidentally. Talking about mangling folks up. Why, when Barry Rogers turned loose that old double-barreled shotgun of his loaded with slugs at anybody— Here, waiter, called the New Yorker. 2 more of the same. It is acknowledged by everyone that our city is the center of art and literature and learning. Take, for instance, our after-dinner speakers. Where else in the country would you find such wit and eloquence as emanate from Depew and Ford and— If you take the papers, interrupted the Westerner, you must have read of Pete Webster's daughter. The Websters live 2 blocks north of the courthouse in Topaz City. Miss Tilly Webster, she slept 40 days and nights without waking up. The doctors said that— Pass the matches, please, said the New Yorker. Have you observed the expedition with which new buildings are being run up in New York? Improved inventions in steel framework and— I noticed, said the Nevadian, that the statistics of Topaz City showed only one carpenter crushed by falling timbers last year, and he was caught in a cyclone. They abuse our skyline, continued the New Yorker, and it is likely that we are not yet artistic in the construction of our buildings. But I can safely assert that we lead in pictorial and decorative art. In some of our houses can be found masterpieces in the way of paintings and sculpture. One who has the entree to our best galleries will find. Back up, exclaimed the man from Topaz City. There was a game last month in our town in which $90,000 changed hands on a pair of tarantara, went the orchestra. The stage curtain, blushing pink at the name asbestos inscribed upon it, came down with a slow midsummer movement. The audience trickled leisurely down the elevator and stairs. On the sidewalk below, the New Yorker and the man from Topaz City shook hands with alcoholic gravity. The elevator crashed raucously, surface cars hummed and clanged, cabmen swore, newsboys shrieked, wheels clattered ear-piercingly. The New Yorker conceived a happy thought, with which he aspired to clinch the preeminence of his city. You must admit, said he, that in the way of noise New York is far ahead of any other. Back to the Everglades, said the man from Topaz City. In 1900, when Sousa's band and the repeating candidate were in our town, you couldn't. The rattle of an express wagon drowned the rest of the words. The Poet and the Peasant, by O. Henry. The other day, a poet friend of mine, who has lived in close communion with nature all his life, wrote a poem and took it to an editor. It was a living pastoral, full of the genuine breath of the fields, the song of birds, and the pleasant chatter of trickling streams. When the poet called again to see about it, with hopes of a beefsteak dinner in his heart, it was handed back to him with the comment, "Too artificial." Several of us met over spaghetti and Dutchess County Chianti, and swallowed indignation with slippery forkfuls. And there we dug a pit for the editor. With us was Conant, a well-arrived writer of fiction, a man who had trod on asphalt all his life, and who had never looked upon bucolic scenes except with sensations of disgust from the windows of express trains. Conant wrote a poem and called it The Doe in the Brook. It was a fine specimen of the kind of work you would expect from a poet who had strayed with Amaryllis only as far as the florist's windows, and whose sole ornithological discussion had been carried on with a waiter. Conant signed this poem, and we sent it to the same editor. But this has very little to do with the story. Just as the editor was reading the first line of the poem, on the next morning, a being stumbled off the West Shore ferry boat and loped slowly up 42nd Street. The invader was a young man with light blue eyes, a hanging lip and hair the exact color of the little orphans, afterward discovered to be the Earl's daughter, in one of Mr. Blaney's plays. His trousers were corduroy, his coat short-sleeved, with buttons in the middle of his back. One bootleg was outside the corduroys. You looked expectantly, though in vain, at his straw hat for ear holes, its shape inaugurating the suspicion that it had been ravaged from a former equine possessor. In his hand was a valise. Description of it is an impossible task. A Boston man would not have carried his lunch and law books to his office in it. And above one ear, in his hair, was a wisp of hay, the rustic's letter of credit, his badge of innocence, the last clinging touch of the Garden of Eden lingering to shame the gold brick men. Knowingly, smilingly, the city crowds passed him by. They saw the raw stranger stand in the gutter and stretch his neck at the tall buildings. At this they ceased to smile, and even to look at him. It had been done so often. A few glanced at the antique valise to see what coney attraction or brand of chewing gum he might be thus dinning into his memory. But for the most part he was ignored. Even the newsboys looked bored when he scampered like a circus clown out of the way of cabs and streetcars. At 8th Avenue stood Bunko Harry, with his dyed mustache and shiny, good-natured eyes. Harry was too good an artist not to be pained at the sight of an actor overdoing his part. He edged up to the countryman, who had stopped to open his mouth at a jewelry store window, and shook his head. "Too thick, pal," he said, critically, "too thick by a couple of inches. I don't know what your lay is, but you've got the properties too thick. That hay, now why, they don't even allow that on Proctor's Circuit anymore." "I don't understand you, mister," said the green one. "I'm not looking for any circus." I've just run down from Ulster County to look at the town, being that the haying's over with. Gosh, but it's a whopper. I thought Poughkeepsie was some pumpkins, but this here town is 5 times as big. Oh, well, said Bunko Harry, raising his eyebrows. I didn't mean to butt in. You don't have to tell. I thought you ought to tone down a little, so I tried to put you wise. Wish you success at your graft, whatever it is. Come and have a drink, anyhow. I wouldn't mind having a glass of lager beer, acknowledged the other. They went to a cafe frequented by men with smooth faces and shifty eyes, and sat at their drinks. I'm glad I come across you, mister, said Haylocks. How'd you like to play a game or two of 7-Up? I've got the keards. He fished them out of Noah's valise, a rare, inimitable deck, greasy with bacon suppers and grimy with the soil of cornfields. Bunko Harry laughed loud and briefly. Not for me, sport, he said, firmly. I don't go against that makeup of yours for a cent, but I still say you've overdone it. The Reubs haven't dressed like that since '79. I doubt if you could work Brooklyn for a key winding watch with that layout. Oh, you needn't think I ain't got the money, boasted Haylocks. He drew forth a tightly rolled mass of bills as large as a teacup and laid it on the table. Got that for my share of grandmother's farm, he announced. There's $950 in that roll. Thought I'd come to the city and look around for a likely business to go into. Bunko Harry took up the roll of money and looked at it with almost respect in his smiling eyes. I've seen worse, he said, critically, but you'll never do it in them clothes. You want to get light tin shoes and a black suit and a straw hat with a colored band and talk a good deal about Pittsburgh and freight differentials and drink sherry for breakfast in order to work off phony stuff like that. What's his line? Asked 2 or 3 shifty-eyed men of Bunko Harry after Haylocks had gathered up his impugned money and departed. The queer, I guess, said Harry. Or else he's one of Jerome's men, or some guy with a new graft. He's too much hayseed. Maybe that his I wonder now. No, it couldn't have been real money. Haylocks wandered on. Thirst probably assailed him again, for he dived into a dark groggery on a side street and bought beer. At first sight of him their eyes brightened, but when his insistent and exaggerated rusticity became apparent their expressions changed to wary suspicion. Haylocks swung his valise across the bar. Keep that a while for me, mister, he said, chewing at the end of a virulent claybank cigar. I'll be back after I knock around a spell, and keep your eye on it, for there's $950 inside of it, though maybe you wouldn't think so to look at me. Somewhere outside a phonograph struck up a band piece, and Haylocks was off for it, his coat-tail buttons flopping in the middle of his back. Divvy, Mike, said the men hanging upon the bar, winking openly at one another. Honest now, said the bartender, kicking the valise to one side. You don't think I'd fall to that, do you? Anybody can see he ain't no Jay. One of McAdoo's come on squad, I guess. He's a shine if he made himself up. There ain't no parts of the country now where they dress like that since they run rural free delivery to Providence, Rhode Island. If he's got $9.50 in that valise, it's a 98-cent Waterbury that stopped at 10 minutes to 10. When Haylocks had exhausted the resources of Mr. Edison to amuse, he returned for his valise. And then down Broadway he gallivanted, culling the sights with his eager blue eyes. But still and evermore Broadway rejected him with curt glances and sardonic smiles. He was the oldest of the gags that the city must endure. He was so flagrantly impossible, so ultra-rustic, so exaggerated beyond the most freakish products of the barnyard, the hayfield and the vaudeville stage, that he excited only weariness and suspicion, and the wisp of hay in his hair was so genuine, so fresh and redolent of the meadows, so clamorously rural that even a shell game man would have put up his peas and folded his table at the sight of it. Haylocks seated himself upon a flight of stone steps and once more exhumed his roll of yellow backs from the valise. The outer one, a 20, he shucked off and beckoned to a newsboy. Son, said he, run somewhere and get this changed for me. I'm mighty nigh out of chicken feed. I guess you'll get a nickel if you'll hurry up. A hurt look appeared through the dirt on the newsie's face. Ah, watch her tink. Gwan and get your funny bill changed yourself. Dey ain't no farm clothes you're got on. Gwan with your stage money. On a corner lounged a keen-eyed steerer for a gambling house. He saw Haylocks, and his expression suddenly grew cold and virtuous. "Mister," said the rural one, "I've heard of places in this here town where a fellow could have a good game of old sledge or peg a card at Keno. I got $950 in this valise, and I come down from Old Ulster to see the sights. Know where a fellow could get action on about $9 or $10. I'm going to have some sport, and then maybe I'll buy out a business of some kind." The steerer looked pained and investigated a white speck on his left forefinger nail. "Cheese it, old man," he murmured, reproachfully. "The central office must be bughouse to send you out looking like such a gilly. You couldn't get within 2 blocks of a sidewalk crap game in them Tony Pastor props. The recent Mr. Scotty from Death Valley has got you beat a cross-down block in the way of Elizabethan scenery and mechanical accessories. Let it be skidoo for yours. Nay, I know of no gilded halls where one may bet a patrol wagon on the ace." Rebuffed once again by the great city that is so swift to detect artificialities, Haylocks sat upon the curb and presented his thoughts to hold a conference. "It's my clothes," said he, "derned if it ain't. They think I'm a hayseed and won't have nothing to do with me. Nobody never made fun of this hat in Ulster County. I guess if you want folks to notice you in New York, you must dress up like they do." So Haylocks went shopping in the bazaars where men spake through their noses and rubbed their hands, and ran the tape line ecstatically over the bulge in his inside pocket where reposed a red nubbin of corn with an even number of rows. And messengers bearing parcels and boxes streamed to his hotel on Broadway within the lights of Long Acre. At 9 o'clock in the evening, one descended to the sidewalk whom Ulster County would have forsworn. Bright tan were his shoes, his hat the latest block. His light gray trousers were deeply creased. A gay blue silk handkerchief flapped from the breast pocket of his elegant English walking coat. His collar might have graced a laundry window. His blonde hair was trimmed close. The wisp of hay was gone. For an instant he stood, resplendent, with the leisurely air of a boulevardier, concocting in his mind the route for his evening pleasures. And then he turned down the gay, bright street with the easy and graceful tread of a millionaire. But in the instant that he had paused, the wisest and keenest eyes in the city had enveloped him in their field of vision. A stout man with gray eyes picked 2 of his friends with a lift of his eyebrows from the row of loungers in front of the hotel. "The juiciest jay I've seen in 6 months," said the man with gray eyes. "Come along." It was 11:30 when a man galloped into the West 47th Street police station with the story of his wrongs. $950, he gasped. "All my share of grandmother's farm." The desk sergeant wrung from him the name Jabez Boltung, of Locust Valley Farm, Ulster County, and then began to take descriptions of the strong-armed gentleman. When Conant went to see the editor about the fate of his poem, he was received over the head of the office boy into the inner office that is decorated with the statuettes by Rodin and J.G. Brown. "When I read the first line of The Doe and the Brook," said the editor, "I knew it to be the work of one whose life has been heart to heart with nature. The finished art of the line did not blind me to that fact. To use a somewhat homely comparison, it was as if a wild, free child of the woods and fields were to don the garb of fashion and walk down Broadway. Beneath the apparel the man would show." "Thanks," said Conant. "I suppose the check will be round on Thursday, as usual." The morals of this story have somehow gotten mixed. You can take your choice of stay on the farm or don't write poetry.